Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Good afternoon. My name is Amy Draves, and I'm here to introduce Charles Duhigg, who is visiting us as part of the Microsoft Research Visiting Speaker Series. Charles is here today to discuss his book, The Power of Habit: Why We Do What We Do in Life and Business. The key to changing habits is to understand how they work. If you can diagnose the habit, you can change it in any way you like. Charles Duhigg is a reporter for the New York Times and has contributed to NPR, This American Life, and Frontline. He has won the George Polk and National Academies of Science Awards and was a finalist for the 2009 Pulitzer Prize. Please join me in giving him a very warm welcome.
Hi. Can you guys hear me? Is this okay? Good. My name is Charles. Thank you, all of you, for coming today. It's enormously kind of you to come and take some time out of what was yesterday a beautiful day and is today a rainy day. I'm a reporter at the New York Times and the author of this book, and I'll mention, and might be why some of you are here, that at the Times I don't actually write about habits. I'm writing a series called The I Economy about Apple and looking at Apple's working conditions overseas and sort of using Apple as a lens. I imagine a number of people in this audience feel strongly about Apple and perhaps have read that series. If you have any questions about it, feel free to ask me. But right now I'll just talk about habits, which is another way of saying also if you have any questions during this presentation, feel free to raise your hand and interrupt me. I'd love to, particularly if you think that what I'm saying is totally untrue or doesn't make any sense. Those are my favorite kinds of questions. So feel free to tell me that you totally disagree. So the book that I wrote, The Power of Habit, started about 10 years ago when I was a reporter in Iraq. And I had been sent over to Iraq because I thought it would be very interesting to be in a war zone. I had never been in a war zone before. Turns out it is very interesting. It's also terrifying and awful. And so I figured out pretty quickly that my number one goal in Iraq was to be in places where no one could shoot at me, which turns out to be harder than I thought it would be. But so I heard about this one army major about an hour south of Baghdad that was doing this experiment in a city named Kufa. Kufa was one of these towns where riots would break out all the time and people were being killed. And so the army major had been sent down to Kufa, and his assignment was stop the riots. So this guy shows up, he studies a whole bunch of videotapes of riots that were shot by drones. He goes to the town mayor and he says a whole laundry list of requests. And his last request is, can you take all of the food vendors out of the plazas in Kufa? And the mayor, who's dealing with suicide bombers and all types of terrible stuff, says, sure, I can take all the food vendors out. That's the easiest thing you've asked me to do. So a couple of weeks later, this crowd starts growing around the Grand Mosque of Kufa, which is this very contentious mosque. And the crowd gets bigger and bigger over time. And what the army major explained to me is that when riots happen, they take hours to develop. Like on the news, it looks like they just broke out, right? But those people have been in that plaza for hours and hours and hours until eventually something kind of sparks and the entire crowd goes wild. So the crowd grows and grows and grows and grows. Time goes by, it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. It gets to about 5:30, people are hungry, and they start looking for all the food vendors that they normally buy kebabs from. And they're not there. So the people at the outer ring of this crowd go home because they're hungry and they're just spectators. And then the people who are one ring in see these people leaving and think to themselves, where are they going? The party must be someplace else. Like, why am I hanging out if everyone else? So they leave. And then the people one ring in, they leave as well, until eventually you get to these rabble-rousers who are the people who start the riot in the first place. And they look around and realize there's nobody there. So they go home. And over the 9-month period that the major had been there hadn't been any riots. So when I talked to this guy, I was totally fascinated by this. I could talk to him in a very well-fortified building where no one could shoot at me. And so I had asked as many questions as I could. And I said, how did you know that this was going to happen, that removing the food vendors would do this? Because there had been riots for years in Kufa. And what he said was that the military is essentially this huge habit experiment, right? When you enroll, is anyone a veteran? I don't know if anyone. Oh, okay, so a couple of people. So you know this far better than I do. When you enroll in the military, basically their whole goal is to teach you these new habits, right? Like when people are shooting at you, instead of running away like sensible people do, stand there and shoot back. Or more importantly, how do you get along with people that you can't stand? Or how do you make decisions when you're exhausted or when you're under fire? Or how do you talk to your spouse when you're on another continent? Or even just spending habits. How do you save money? The military is this huge, huge laboratory for changing habits. And what this major told me is that once you start looking at the world through the lens of these habits, once you sort of understand how they work, all of a sudden everything looks different. And you understand that a riot can be stopped by taking away the food vendors. So I thought this was totally fascinating. So I came back to the US and I started researching about studies that were going on around the science of habit formation. And let me just start by telling you what a habit is, at least for purposes of this talk, which is a habit is a decision that you made at some point and then stopped making but continued acting on. So backing your car out of your driveway, the first couple of times you did it, it took this major dose of concentration, right? It's actually a very complicated thing because you have to do spatial calculations, look in mirrors, reversed images. But when you back your car out of your driveway now, you just do it. You don't even have to think about it, right? You can think about the meeting you have later that day or realize that you left your kids' lunch on the counter. That's a habit. And the story I really want to tell you today is about this product named Febreze. Does anyone use Febreze? Okay, a couple of people use Febreze. To tell you about this product, which is one of the best-selling products in the nation, I actually have to start by telling you this story about a rat. About a decade ago, a woman named Anne Graybiel at MIT, who's a neurologist, and her colleagues perfected a system for putting hundreds of small little sensors inside the brains of rats so that they could measure relatively small neurological changes as the rats behave. They would do this surgery, the rats would wake up, it looks like they have a joystick coming out of their head. They don't even know, or as far as we know, they never complain about it, right? They just sort of act like normal rats. So Anne Graybiel and her colleagues would do this to a number of rats, and then what they would do is they would drop them in the world's simplest maze. It's a T-shaped maze. Same thing would happen every single time. There would be a click. A partition would move, the rat would be free to run up and down the maze, and in one of the T's there's a piece of chocolate. So the first couple of times that you drop any rat into this maze, the same thing will happen. Click, partition moves, the rat will start looking like the world's laziest rat. What it'll do is, like, you would imagine that it would smell the chocolate and kind of run towards it. That's not what the rat does. What it does is it kind of wanders up and then wanders back, and it'll scratch on the walls and sniff at the air, and eventually it'll find the chocolate and eat the chocolate. But it doesn't look like the rat is working for it very hard. But what Graybiel was able to figure out by watching the sensors inside the rat's brains was that despite the fact that the rat looked lazy, it was actually thinking hard the entire time. Whenever the rat would scratch on the walls, the scratching centers would light up, or the sniff in the air and the sniffing centers would light up. I'm oversimplifying, because if anyone's a neurologist, you know that there is no such thing as like a scratching center. But the point being that this is a representation of what was going on in the rat's head. It was thinking hard the entire time, trying to figure out what's going on. So Graybiel and her colleagues dropped the rat in again and again and again. And over time, the rat actually learns the maze, right? Click, partition moves, the rat zips to the chocolate. Gets faster and faster and faster every single time. Doesn't scratch, doesn't sniff. From a neurological perspective, what happens is that the rat develops a habit for running through the maze and getting to the chocolate. And inside the animal's brain, something kind of fascinating occurs. Its brain essentially stops working as hard. Now, what we know since then is that what's actually happening here is that, if anyone, again, is anyone a neurologist? Okay, because so no one can tell me that I'm getting this all wrong, which is great. Essentially what's happening is that cognition is moving from the prefrontal cortex, which is the part of the brain where essentially decision-making occurs, the most evolutionary advanced part of the brain, into the basal ganglia, which is near the center of your skull and is one of the oldest parts of your brain, and almost every animal has a basal ganglia. As cognition moves from the prefrontal cortex into the basal ganglia, your brain works less and less hard. This is why habits feel so automatic. Is because in one sense, once something becomes a habit, your brain has kind of gone to sleep. You're no longer participating in decision making around that activity, except at two kind of interesting points. If you'll notice, what happens is that the brain activity of the rat would spike at the beginning of the habit when it heard the click. And then it would spike again at the end when it found the chocolate, as if it was shaking itself awake to sort of get the reward and figure out what was going on. This is the neurological signature of a habit. About 40% of the actions you take every day, according to a study from Duhigg, are habits. And every single time you do, if we could put hundreds of sensors into your brain, which I would not recommend, this is exactly what we would see. you would see this pattern of a spike of activity at the beginning and a spike of activity at the end, and relatively low neurological activity in the middle, as your basal ganglia in particular takes over and uses less power. In fact, this is such a predictable pattern that scientists call this the habit loop. Every single habit has three components. There's a cue, which in this case was that click, or for any behavior that you have, is some type of visual or emotional or some other trigger that tells your brain, now it's time to hand things over to the basal ganglia, where the behavior will start to unfold automatically. And that behavior itself is the routine. But then at the end of every single habit, there's a reward. And this is how your brain learns or decides to encode this pattern for future use, to essentially remember it in some of the deeper parts of your brain. Discovering the habit loop is kind of revolutionary, because what's happened in the last 10 years as neurologists have begun to understand exactly how to identify and manipulate cues and rewards is that we've begun to understand why some behaviors become habits. Smoking is a great example, right? Does anyone smoke? Is anyone willing to admit that they smoke? At this point, you can't. What's interesting is that we all think of smoking as a physical addiction, and that's true, right? Nicotine is physically addicting, but only for about 100 hours after your last cigarette. Once nicotine is out of your blood system, there is no physical addiction to it anymore. And yet, we all know people who, 2 weeks or 2 months or 2 years after they quit smoking, when they sit down with their morning paper, they have an urge for a cigarette. That's not a physical addiction asserting itself. It's the habit. The cue there is that, in fact, the morning paper and the routine is that they used to light up. And the reward was that nicotine is actually makes you feel, gives you energy, right? Nicotine is actually kind of fun. That's why people smoke. And in fact, as therapies have begun recognizing the cues and rewards in people's lives around smoking, the smoking rate has plummeted, particularly in the last 7 years, for a number of reasons, but part of it being sort of this identification. In addition, I'm sure everyone here is familiar with smartphones. Research in Motion about 7 years ago was doing some research and figured out that if they could make their phones vibrate, that for some reason people's use of them for the BlackBerry all of a sudden doubled. And the reason why is because a vibrating phone in your pocket provides an obvious cue. And in fact, they did neurological studies where they would try and figure out what was the reward that was being provided. And it's that once you're triggered with this curiosity of, why did someone just email me? You have this unbearable craving to actually check and see what it is, because intermittently, some of those emails that you receive will be kind of fun to read, right? Particularly more fun than maybe having conversation with your 3-year-old at the dinner table. So when your phone vibrates in your pocket, even though you know, and I'm speaking as someone who has a 3-year-old that I make conversation with about superheroes every single night, even though you know you should ignore that vibrating phone, the cue has triggered this craving, this routine of checking and trying to get that reward. And moreover, this insight has helped create a number of positive habits. There was a huge experiment that was done a couple of years ago about creating exercise habits. And what they found was the most effective way to create exercise habits is to ask people to choose obvious cues. Always exercise at the same time each day, or put on your running shoes before breakfast. And more importantly, to choose a reward at the end. In particular, eating a small piece of chocolate after you've worked out. And the reason why, it seems counterintuitive, right? The whole point of working out is to lose weight, and yet the scientists are telling you to eat a small piece of chocolate. It's because initially your brain does not believe you that you enjoy exercise. And so you have to trick it for the first couple of weeks. And what they found, this was a huge study in Germany, was that in about 2 or 3 weeks, people stopped eating the chocolate. They didn't need the chocolate. Their brain learned that it would eventually be delivered endocannabinoids and endorphins, things that that are rewarding. But in the meantime, you have to sort of trick your neurology. The point being just that this habit loop is kind of an interesting insight, and that the implications of it, once you can begin breaking down behaviors, are relatively significant. But as I mentioned, the entire reason I was telling you this story is just to tell you about Febreze. So Febreze, for anyone who hasn't used it, is this amazing spray. In fact, instead of telling you about it, let me just tell you how they found it. There was a researcher at Procter & Gamble in Cincinnati who was working on a chemical whose name I cannot pronounce, but whose initials are HPBCD. So this guy is working on HPBCD. He actually thinks that it's this something that he might be able to add to Tide that will make whites whiter. So he's been working with it in the lab. He goes home that night, and his wife meets him at the door. This guy was a long-time smoker. His wife comes to the door, and she says, "Oh, did you quit smoking today?" And the guy just blows up because they had been like to marriage counseling over his smoking, and she had been bugging him to quit smoking, and he kept on saying no, he didn't want to quit smoking, and she was trying to control his life, and blah. So anyway, she says, did you quit smoking today? And the guy says, no, I didn't quit smoking. I don't understand why you're always asking me if I've quit smoking. I'm not going to talk about this anymore. And she says, no. It's not, I'm not trying to bother you about this. It's that you don't smell like cigarette smoke, and usually when you come home, you smell like cigarette smoke. So the guy goes back to the lab, and he starts playing with HPPCD. And what he realizes is that it's this kind of amazing chemical that if you add it to water and then aerosolize it, spray it onto fabrics, it'll draw scents out of fabrics. And as the moisture evaporates, the scent essentially disappears. In fact, this technology is so interesting and powerful that they spend millions of dollars making it into a product, and it's so good that NASA ends up using this to clean space shuttles when they come back from space, because one of the things they don't tell you in the movies is that space apparently smells terrible, and they need to clean the shuttles when they come back. The guy goes to his bosses at Procter & Gamble, and he explains what he has here, and they're ecstatic. Because one of the biggest issues that consumers had been complaining about was that they can't get rid of bad smells, right? People would go to a smoky bar and then leave their jacket outside because they didn't want to dry clean it to get the cigarette smoke out. People with pets were constantly saying, give me something to help me clean up after my pets. So Procter & Gamble spends millions of dollars, and they create it into a product named Febreze. And they give it to a marketing team led by a guy named Drake Stimson. And on this team are a number of psychologists, consumer psychologists, as well as people who had studied the neurology of habit formation. And they come up with a marketing plan that's essentially built around what seems to be the most obvious habit loop on the face of the planet. We're going to sell this to people who have bad smells in their life. The bad smell itself will be the cue. They'll spray Febreze. It will make the bad smells disappear. This stuff will sell itself. In fact, people sort of figured that this was going to make them $1 million, gazillion dollars, $1 billion. And so they decide to go into a couple of test markets, Boise, Salt Lake City, and outside of Arizona, Phoenix, to test them. And they air some commercials like this.
Guess what the kids call Dad's easy chair?
The stinky chair.
You know, I have a stinky chair problem too. His name is George. Well, now there's a way to get bad smells out of fabrics for good.
It's called Febreze. It's new, and you won't believe how many places you'll find to spray it.
See, Febreze helps clean fabrics in a way you never could before.
And it's not just covering one smell with another.
Exactly. Just spray Febreze. Its patented cleaning system finds the smells trapped in fabrics and gently cleans them away as it dries.
Once it's dry, the smell's gone. For good.
Febreze, check the Montreal.
And check this out.
It's safe, from dress blues to teddy bears. Febreze cleans bad smells out of fabrics. For good.
I wonder if they'll call it the sleepy chair now.
There's two things I love about this commercial. The first is that you don't really realize that the late 90s had a visual aesthetic until it's like thrown in your face. You're like, oh, right, I used to own clothing just like that, and I don't anymore. Number two is that this is actually like a great ad, right? Like in marketing, you're supposed to identify your goals and kind of get the message across, and this commercial does it perfectly. It tells you how Febreze works, that it's for bad smells. When I talked to Drake Stimson about this, he said that everyone on his team, after they had seen the ad and started rolling it out, all sat down and they wrote down what they were going to buy with their bonuses. And at the top of Drake Stimson's list was a Ferrari, that he was going to buy this brand new Ferrari. He actually showed me the picture of the Ferrari. It's a pretty cool Ferrari. Needless to say, absolutely no one on that team bought anything that they were going to get with their bonuses. Febreze, after they rolled this out, was one of the biggest disappointments in Procter & Gamble's history. It was a total bomb. They would go give the product away, and people wouldn't use it. They went into some people's houses, and they would say, do you have that bottle of Febreze that we gave you for free that you can use, that's revolutionary, that gets rid of any scent on the face of the planet? And then the person they would be talking to would say, oh, yeah, I think I remember, and like go through all their shelves and find a brand new full bottle in the back of the shelf and say, I just found it. Do you want it back? Because I never, ever use it. This was a bad thing for Procter & Gamble, for Drake Stimson, for Ferrari dealers. Everyone was concerned about the fact that this product that was supposed to be one of the biggest products in Procter & Gamble's history was not selling at all. So they started doing some interviews with customers. In particular, things kind of clicked for them when they went and they talked to this woman who lived right outside of Scottsdale. She was a woman who owned some cats. And are there any cat owners here? Okay, a couple of cat owners. So you know, cats sometimes have a scent associated with them. Most people own 1 or 2 cats. This woman owned a lot of cats. In fact, so many cats that when the researchers walked into her house, and they walked in the living room where the cats lived, one of them started gagging because the scent of cat was so overpowering. So they sit down with her and they say, you know, she'd gotten a couple bottles of Febreze some weeks previously, and they said, we're trying to figure out why no one's using Febreze. You know, do you like Febreze? And she said, oh yeah, I used it a couple times, I like it. And they said, well, you know, do you use it for like, you know, cat smells? And she says, oh, you know, once or twice. I've used it when there's a cat smell. And the guy who literally was gagging just a couple of minutes ago and is sitting on the couch says, well, you know, he actually described it as like he was holding his nose. He's like, well, you know, do you use it right now for your cat smell right now? And the woman says, no, you know the most amazing thing? I have the best cats. None of them smell that often, so I don't need to use your Febreze. This was why Febreze was failing, is because, and all of you know this, if you have bad smells in your life, it's the unique nature of sense that you stop smelling the bad smells, right? This is, in fact, you've probably been paranoid about this at some point in your life. If you smoke, for instance, smoking itself damages your olfactory senses so much that you cannot smell the cigarette smoke anymore. Or cats is another great example. The dander that is part of the reason why cats smell like cats and the musk, you become desensitized to it. So the entire habit loop that all these folks had come up with that's supposed to be cued by bad smells, the people who most need Febreze, who have bad smells in their life, they can't detect this cue. And not only that, but the reward that you're going to make bad smells disappear, that reward is worthless to someone who doesn't understand that they have bad smells in the first place. There's no reward inherent in the reward itself. That's why the habit of using Febreze had never emerged among their consumers. So, everyone from the Procter & Gamble team goes back to Cincinnati, to their headquarters. And they start reviewing videotapes. This is stock footage because Procter & Gamble won't let me use their actual videotapes. Procter & Gamble, however, has the largest library of videotapes of people cleaning their homes on the face of the planet. If you go to Procter & Gamble and you're willing, in exchange for 6 months of free toilet paper or paper towels, they will come and they will install cameras in your home, in your living room, in your bedroom, in your bathroom, that will videotape you as you clean. So I went and I watched some of these. The best part about this is that, like, in the first couple of days, you can see people being very self-conscious about the video camera that's, for instance, in their bathroom. Literally, all it takes is like 4 days, and they've totally forgotten that the video camera exists, and they do crazy things. But that's not, the crazy things is not what Procter & Gamble is interested in. What they're interested in fact, they cut the tapes down, is how do people clean? And what they found was these kind of interesting patterns, habits, that people automatically do when they clean. One of them was, for instance, when people would vacuum. They would vacuum the floor. They would look at the freshly vacuumed floor, all the lines on the carpet, and then they would kind of take this moment as if to admire their handiwork, right? Which all of you have done. When people make their beds, this was very common. People would make their beds, right? You put the sheets, you plump the pillows, you straighten the comforter, and then very often people would look at the freshly made bed and smile. Or, this is actually my favorite. Again, this is stock footage because there's really nothing I love more with my child in the morning than cleaning the window together. Such a special moment. But what would happen very often when people would clean the mirrors is they'd come in, right? The mirror has some spots on it. You can still see your reflection. People would spray the mirror with cleaning stuff, would wipe the mirror, and then would look at their reflection and smile at themselves, which you're laughing because all of you have done this, right? You wiped the mirror and then smiled at your own reflection. What was interesting is that every single time they watched a cleaning ritual, they saw this habit. And they realized that at the end of all of these rituals, there was already this reward. People were giving themselves their own reward associated with cleaning. And this is how they figured out they could sell Febreze. So they went back and they figured out a new habit loop to market against. This time, instead of the cue being bad smells, the cue would be the act of cleaning itself, which most people do at least every other day. I know a couple of coders that I don't think they do it every other day, but at some point in someone's life, they clean on a regular basis. The routine would be that at the end of the cleaning ritual, that they would spray Febreze, and then the reward, this was the tough part, is how do you create a reward? Because the reward has to be something that's genuinely rewarding. So they went back to the lab, and they spent another $4 million creating a perfume that was strong enough to withstand Febreze, that they could then pour into the Febreze bottles so that Febreze had a scent of its own. And there you go. It's a habit loop that makes a lot of sense. The irony here is that Febreze was invented as a product to get rid of bad smells, and it's become a product that's essentially an air freshener that you use only after everything is clean. But they decided to take a test, and they put together some new commercials, and they aired them in the same test markets. And I'll show you a couple of them.
Get your fix of freshness. Febreze. Anytime, anywhere, it's a breath of fresh air.
Shouldn't I be the one on the couch, doctor?
No.
Okay, that's good.
Get your fix of freshness. Febreze. Anytime, anywhere, it's a breath of fresh air.
I'm going to show you one more. And in this next one, I just want you to count how many times they say the word bad smell or odor or absolutely anything that would indicate what Febreze is used for.
What do you think it means?
Maybe it's Morse code.
Yeah.
Get your fix of freshness with Febreze. Anytime, anywhere, it's a breath of fresh air.
Okay, if you came down from outer space and you saw these ads, you would think that this is a product exclusively marketed for obsessive compulsive disorder, right? That there's no why would someone smell their drapes over and over and over again? There's nothing in this commercial that actually tells you that it has to do with bad smells. Everything is about creating good smells. But when they roll out these ads, sales of Febreze explode. Within the first 6 months, they sold $200 million worth of Febreze in their test markets and in the secondary markets that they went to. Today, Febreze is one of $13 billion a year products that Procter & Gamble sells. It's, as everyone in this room probably knows, unless you're selling software, it's really hard to get to $1 billion a year for things that only cost like $12 or $5 when you buy them each time. But what they found is that once people started using Febreze, once they became habituated to that scent, that sort of small celebration at the end of the cleaning ritual of a good smell that smells as nice as everything looks, they started going through a bottle once every 2 weeks. It just became automatic that you would pick it up at the end of the cleaning ritual and spray Febreze and deliver this small reward. This is just sort of an aspect of the book. The book itself goes into a lot of other sort of aspects of how habits work, in particular about how organizational habits work, how habits form across groups or societies, and how they can be influenced by understanding the same sort of principles of the habit loop. And rather than go into all of that, I'll just sort of flick at a couple of them. One of the chapters is about Tony Dungy, who's a football coach, who some of you might be familiar with, who transformed 2 teams and ended up winning the Super Bowl. What Dungy did is he basically changed how his teams play by attacking their habits, what they did automatically on field. And in fact, the same principles that he used sort of explain how Alcoholics Anonymous work. And at the core of it is this basic science, which has been known as the golden rule of habit change, which says that cues and rewards are so powerful that the best way of sustainably changing a habit is to try and focus exclusively on the routine, on the behavior. That if you want to change someone's habit, be it a football player or someone who's an alcoholic, that what you should do is you should diagnose what the cue and the reward is, and then find a replacement routine that is triggered by the same behavior and delivers the same reward. It satisfies the same craving. For whatever reason, this seems much more effective in clinical studies in changing habits. And as I mentioned, this actually kind of explains how Alcoholics Anonymous works. You know, AA is like the least scientific therapy on the face of the planet. It was invented by people who have almost no background in psychology whatsoever. Like the reason why there's 12 steps is because there's 12 apostles in the Bible. And the guy who actually came up with them wrote them in about 45 minutes while sitting in bed one night on his way to dinner. And yet AA for millions and millions of people has proved this enormously effective therapy. And the reason why is because what AA does is it basically gives you new habits. It used to be that you had a bad day at work, you'd go to the bar, talk to your friends, sort of find some type of sensation relief from alcohol. And the reward was that you got all this stuff off your chest. You relieved tension. What AA says is, look, there's nothing wrong with this impulse. It's just that when you come home from work and you've had a terrible day, instead of going to the bar, just go to a meeting. And if anyone's ever been to an AA meeting, you know that there are these intensely emotional experiences. The whole meeting is designed to actually create an emotional catharsis. Someone stands up, they tell their life story, all these terrible things happened. The whole point is that as a group, you go through an emotional journey every single night. And it provides the exact same reward, this sense of relief, of getting things off your chest, of having some kind of cathartic experience. And that's why it's effective for a number of people. I'll just quickly mention, there's also been some interesting research. Yeah?
So does that cause addiction to the routine of going through an emotional journey every day?
Yeah, so the question was, does that cause addiction to the routine of going through an emotional journey every day? Yeah, I think it does. I mean, so there's this interesting question about where habits and addictions begin and end, right? And in fact, if you talk to addiction specialists, what they'll say is, at this point, the technical definition of addiction involves habit dysfunction, because there's a number of behaviors that we can't explain through biochemical reliance, but that does seem to be based on some type of habit dysfunction. But to the person who's in the grip of a smoking addiction, even if they're not addicted to nicotine anymore, or alcohol, even if they're not physically dependent upon alcohol, a habit dysfunction and addiction feel the same way. And so that's why it's so unclear where the line actually exists. In fact, which brings me to this really interesting research that was done a couple of years ago by a guy named Reza Habib, who's a neurologist. He was asking sort of a similar question, which is why some people are gambling addicts, right? Because in gambling, there is no external drug that you're delivering to your system, but we all know that there are people who seem to be addicted to gambling. So he took a whole bunch of people who had gambling problems, people who didn't have gambling problems, and he put them in fMRI machines and watched as they looked at slot machines. And the slot machines were programmed to give one of three outcomes: either a win, a loss, or what's called a near win, when like all the cherries would almost line up and then at the last second, one of them wouldn't. What he found is that people who are gambling addicts, their brains, when they saw a near miss, would react almost as if they had just experienced a win. Whereas everyone else would see a near miss as what it is. It's a miss, it's a loss. And so as a result, these two groups of people would actually see the same event, and one of them neurologically would react completely differently. Here's the other interesting aspect of this. Habib found that he could actually train people in and out of this state. So with enough exposure and enough rewards paired with near misses, he could make someone into a neurologically problem gambler, or make them into someone who neurologically does not see a near miss as a win, but in fact sees it accurately as a loss. All of which is, I think, kind of fascinating. But the point being that at the core of this is this emerging body of research that uses the habit loop as a basis for trying to understand why these habitual patterns emerge in our life, and that we're learning some really, really interesting things about them, and we'll continue. And the book, if you get a chance to read it, goes into many more of the details. So I'd love to answer any questions if anyone has any, and thank you again all for coming. Yeah?
What was the most surprising thing that popped out at you when researching the book, writing the book?
So I'd say two things. The first was just how malleable habits are, right? So if you talk to researchers who work on this stuff, what they'll tell you is that at this point, because we understand so precisely how to define cues and rewards, absolutely any habit can be changed. Doesn't matter how old you are, doesn't matter how ingrained the behavior is. Someone who's 75 years old and is obesely overweight can be taught to change their eating habits. The other thing that was really interesting was, and I actually did part of my research here at Microsoft, which didn't unfortunately make it into the book, but I went over to talk to the Xbox guys, and then talk to Bungy, which obviously is no longer part of you guys, but for a number of years obviously was. So the other really surprising part was how precisely people who are not neurologists can cue into this information, right? So like when I talk to the Bungie guys or the guys over at Xbox, they know exactly how to create reward schedules that abide by all of these principles. None of them know, that I met at least, knew the psychological research or the neurological research. But through trial and error, they had figured out how to create these reward schedules, particularly in Halo, that made the game essentially completely habit-forming. And so that's the other interesting part about it, is how intuitive some of this becomes once you study it, once you're close to running experiments against it frequently enough. Yeah?
I've heard people say that it takes 21 days to make a new habit. Is that what your research supports?
No, unfortunately, so there's unfortunately no formula for creating a habit. If you want to create a habit that involves, say, like chocolate or fried food, like 12 minutes, I think you could probably create. If you want to create one for exercise, it'll probably take a little bit longer.
So do you find there's any general sort of time frame for how long it takes to create a new habit?
Well, so let me answer it this way, which is it differs from person to person and habit to habit, right? Some people neurologically can form habits more easily, and some people can't. But because of the way that the neurology around this functions, what happens is that when you're creating a habit and you have this reward that's sort of creating this loop, you're essentially broadcasting, almost like a radio broadcast, neurotransmitters associated with reward. And whichever neurons are most active when that broadcast occurs, they become thicker. And as a result, electrical impulses can run down that neurological pathway faster next time. Which is a long way of saying every single time you do a habit, it gets easier and easier and easier. So on day 3, it's going to be easier than day 1. And on day 21, it'll be easier than day 3. And on 3 months, it'll definitely be easier. And at some point, it tips over where the entire activity is essentially residing in the basal ganglia. And that's when it begins to feel automatic. And there's no real rule about when that happens. But I can promise you that it gets easier every single time. And what we know about actually human experience, based on a lot of the behavioral economic work, is that when things start feeling easier, we tend to experience them as being much, much easier. So that's why, for instance, the first step feels so hard and then subsequent steps still feel easier, is because of this principle known as temporal discounting. Which again is a long way of saying, if you start creating the habit, the first step, once you get past the first step, it will get subsequently much easier than you expect it to be. Yeah?
2 questions. One is about Target. How did you stumble upon that story? How did you know what they were doing in the inside of their organization?
So if you're not familiar, so we ran an excerpt in the New York Times Magazine about Target, which uses predictive analytics and behavioral profiling to figure out which of its customers are pregnant. And particularly, they're looking at shopping habits. And they're very, very good at it. Even if you don't tell your father that you're pregnant, Target will be able to figure out that you are pregnant. The way I found the story is I called around asking for, I was actually going to write about Amazon, and I called people and they said, Amazon won't tell you anything. It's impossible to write about their predictive analytics. And then someone said, but you should really look into Target. There's this guy who came up with a pregnancy prediction algorithm. His name is Andrew Pohl. And so then at the New York Times, we have the ability to look up people's home phone numbers. And so I called him at home. And I said, I'm really interested. And he said, oh, man, I'm so glad you called, because I've been waiting to tell someone about this. It's awesome. So for the next 3 or 4 weeks, we talked all about it. And then I called Target, and I never heard from Andrew Pohl again.
Doing similar stuff that you found exciting, but wasn't willing to go on record.
So I think everyone has really good predictive analytics. Like Microsoft has a great predictive analytics, right? I mean, my understanding is that based on what I've heard, that you guys are collecting a lot of data around ribbon use and trying to figure out how to predict usage patterns. The other kind of surprising companies, there's a company named Darden, which owns Olive Garden and Red Lobster. Darden is a very smart predictive analytics company, particularly about what products, what foods customers are going to want to order at what times of day. The other, and I'll make a plug for a company that that's a new startup. There's a company named Bloomreach, who you probably have not heard of it, but it's a very, very smart company that's essentially search optimizing. They work. Anyone in Bing, I think, would be familiar with them. They're helping companies do dynamic SEO, and their predictive analytics are very impressive. Yeah.
I will ask a question about the iEconomy series. I'm curious, I'm still wrestling with, was Mike Daisy, will his legacy end up being good or bad for the Chinese worker? And you can maybe give people the background because you're a great storyteller, you'll do it better than I will. But I'm curious, did his one-man show, in fact, spark an editor or you at the New York Times to do this, or was that something you were looking at anyway? And what's your thought about the whole legacy?
So just for anyone who's not, so the series that we've written for the New York Times named the iEconomy series, which there's still pieces that are going to come out. One of them focused on conditions in Foxconn factories and other factories that manufacture iPhones and iPads. They also manufacture a number of Microsoft devices, right? Microsoft it has workers in buildings right alongside Apple in those factories. What our reporting documented is that work conditions are harsh, have been harsh within a number of those factories. There's a guy named Mike Daisy who did a one-man show that was broadcast on a radio program named This American Life, who talked about his personal experiences documenting those conditions. It subsequently turned out that he made up a lot of his story, his personal story. The conditions he talked about were largely accurate based on the reporting the New York Times had done, documents Apple had released. He himself had not experienced a lot of the things or seen a lot of the things that he said he saw. So let me answer your question in two ways. The first is, as a rule, we don't talk about other people's reporting, largely just because I have not reported on Mike Daisy. So I don't know exactly like what he lied about and what he didn't lie about. So I'm not in a position where I can say. What I can say is this: our reporting. By the time I was well into doing this reporting is the first time I ever heard of Mike Daisy. I had never heard of this guy before. We don't rely on off-Broadway shows to tell us like what we should be working on. My colleague David Barboza has been writing about Chinese factories for almost a decade. So there was we did not find any inspiration to address this topic because of Mike Daisy. And it's unfortunate that he was untruthful about what he saw. But doesn't impact had no impact. He had no impact on us, and so it doesn't sort of reflect at all on how we thought about these issues. Yeah.
How do you do the opposite of creating a habit? So, and the reason why I'm asking this is a lot of times when we do tasks at work that are repetitive, and this happens in this company as in any other company, in the beginning it's hard, and it gets easier. At some point it's a habit, you just do it, and it gets kind of boring. Now, I'm the kind of guy that once that happens, I look for something new to do, which can be a problem, right? Because you're always just looking for new things to do and new things. And there was a fellow speaker of yours was here actually talking about why human beings are so interested in new things all the time a few weeks ago. So how would you do the opposite?
Well, so this is an interesting question. When academics ask this question, they usually ask a little bit of a variation on it, which is what are known as normal accidents. That when people become habitualized to certain activities, they become much less likely to notice deviations. So as a result, if it's my job to watch a radar to see if enemy aircraft are approaching, and I become habitualized to watching the radar, then the odds of me noticing an enemy aircraft go down significantly. Habits are essentially dangerous, right? You stop being mentally engaged, which I think is exactly what you just said, is that something becomes boring because you're no longer challenged or engaged with it. I unfortunately can't tell you how to make something boring interesting. In fact, I would suggest that the whole reason Microsoft exists and computers in general is to take our boring activities and try and automate them so that we don't have to do them. Okay. When it comes to relationships, I'm not. I mean, I think that what. I don't know about relationships. Although I will say, so when it comes, so I have two kids. I don't know if people have kids. So I have this big problem with my two kids, right? Which is that I love having kids. They're amazing. They're also sometimes the most boring people on the face of the planet, right? Because Oliver is 3 years old, and what he likes to talk about are superheroes. And the amount he knows about superheroes is very, very small. So he tells me the same thing about superheroes over and over and over again. And most of the time he's asking me questions about superheroes. My knowledge of superheroes is also not very big. So these are not the most scintillating conversations I've ever had in my entire life. And yet I know that as a parent, it's important that I'm engaged with my children and not just answering them on autopilot, right? Or if you're in a relationship, it's important that you not just say blah, 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 blah. So when we look into these problems, when researchers are looking at these problems, they refer to them as mindfulness habits. And the question is, how do you become more in the moment? How do you achieve flow, mindfulness around the conversation that's happening when it's inherently a boring conversation? And the answer usually is that you have to find some reward in the moment to keep you aware. Now here's the interesting thing about rewards. Rewards are very, very complicated and can be very, very small. So one of the best ways of doing this with at least kids is if you have something to play with while you're talking to the kid, it provides enough novelty, enough reward to keep you in the moment and aware. Which is one of the reasons why, for instance, like Tinker Toys and stuff like this, I don't know if you have kids, but Tinker Toys are like amazing, right? Because you're talking to the 3-year-old about superheroes, and you can like put the Tinker Toy together, and that's just enough of a reward to keep you in the conversation and not bored out of your mind and thinking like, I have all these emails to reply to. So this kind of gets to a broader lesson though, which is that these rewards, when they happen, can be very, very small and second to second, but that you have to have a reward to satisfy that sensation-seeking impulse or the novelty impulse or whatever it is to keep to keep the behavior in the prefrontal cortex as opposed to allowing it entirely to go to the basal ganglia where you essentially don't participate in it at all. Does that answer your question?
No, that's really good. I want to follow. I'm sorry. So, assuming that we don't have this habit forming function really functioning when we're little babies, we're basically blank and we're taking all this information in. Could it be that your kid asking you over and over and over again is actually creating the habit of habit?
It's creating the habit of asking me?
Of this habit loop.
So
where does the habit loop come from?
The habit loop is innate. It's innate in our neurology. So you don't actually have to learn how to form habits. This is at the foundation of all learning. So from the second that your child, literally from the second your child tastes mother's milk or takes a breath, it's beginning to encode habits. Otherwise, the species wouldn't survive. Yeah.
Have you come across the use of habits for team dynamics, so influencing how teams will work or modifying the habits so that teams might work better together, especially in these organizational settings? Yeah.
So actually, most of the book, the book is, for the middle third is actually a business book exactly about this, about organizational habits, particularly habits across dozens or hundreds or thousands of people within a company. There's some really interesting research by these guys named Nelson and Winter. They're two economists from Yale. And they wrote this like super influential book called An Evolutionary Theory of Economic Change that nobody has read unless you like are into long formulas about economics. But within economics, it's totally transformative because what it says is that companies are actually collections of habits. They call them routines. And that to the point you just raised, the number one way that a habit exerts influence across an organization is it influences how people communicate or how teams work. Most importantly, habits, organizational habits or routines create truces. Because there's an incentive for every individual in a company to essentially screw everyone else in that company, right? Like at some point, if you're going for a promotion, you have an incentive to like sabotage all of your colleagues for that promotion so that you look amazing. But of course we know what would happen, right? If everyone were to sabotage each other, not only would none of you get the promotion and the division would be shut down, but the whole company would go bankrupt. So the question is, how do companies self-organize so that people don't kill each other inside a company as they're competing for limited numbers of goals? The answer is organizational routines. That usually these informal habits emerge. For instance, if someone came to you and asked you how to succeed in Microsoft, you probably wouldn't say anything that appears in a handbook. You would probably give them a bunch of tips that are essentially organizational habits, right? Like if you want to get something done, go to the secretary before you go to her boss or his boss. Or you want to be right on X and Y matters less. All of these organizational routines are how business gets done, and more importantly, how people create truces without having to have conversations about creating truces. So, yeah. Actually, let me get this one back. Yeah.
Oh, I just had a couple things. One was, I was curious, I read a book that was by one of your colleagues that came out last year. It was called Willpower. And I was curious if you talked about willpower at all in that, because I thought the big takeaway from that book was like willpower is like a muscle and you can build it up over time. And they talk about habits a little bit, but I was curious if you deal with willpower at all in relation to this.
There's a whole chapter on willpower, and actually it's built out of Starbucks, relatively close by. Because one of the things that Starbucks does, so you're right, willpower is like a muscle, but what we found is that when you make willpower into a habit, it's less taxing on the muscle. Essentially, it uses different parts of the brain, and so you have larger willpower reserves. And Starbucks has spent a lot of time trying to figure out how to give their employees willpower habits so that at the end of an 8-hour shift, if a screaming customer comes up, they don't scream back, but instead they know exactly what to do, which is a hard problem when you're talking about like high school kids, right? Or you're hiring 1,700 people a day. Not everyone is going to have these life skills. So by giving them willpower habits, they're able to ensure this customer service.
So the two other things I had was just, one was, do you talk about how to like break down or identify habits in the book? Because like, for example, I had this bad habit of staying up late. And it took me a really long time to actually figure out like what the root cause of it was. And it turns out it ended up being just like I hate like the thought of having to go brush my teeth and do all those things that to get ready for bed. So if I do that before I become tired, I no longer have to deal with that. But at first I thought, oh, I like being on the computer. Oh, I'm really interested in finishing this book or doing this project. It had nothing to do with any of those things. But it took me a really long time to figure that out. Like, do you talk about, or did you?
Yeah, so that's a huge part of the science, is actually identifying those cues and rewards. That's an interesting one. I mean, maybe you should just stop brushing your teeth altogether. But yeah, absolutely. That's a huge part of this science, is trying to understand, identify the cues and rewards. Because as I mentioned, the cues and the rewards, they're so subtle sometimes, and they're so hidden from sight. But once you know them, then you can actually start sort of tinkering with the habit. And that's how they change really quickly. Yeah?
What makes some people better at breaking habits?
So the question was, what makes some people better at breaking habits? I think there's two answers to that. The first of which is, well, actually, I think there's just one answer. Basically, what we found is that, and research has shown this again and again, if you understand how to diagnose cues and rewards, you are better at changing your habits, right, or breaking habits. You can't eradicate a habit. That's part of it, is that once it's programmed into your neurology, that pathway is always there. But what you can do is you can change the routine, change the behavior, and develop a new pathway alongside it. But what we know from study after study is that people who have the ability, either intuitively or because it's been taught to them, to identify the trigger and identify the reward and sort of figure out some alternative behavior that corresponds with those are people who seem to more successfully break habits. I think there's also this other line of thinking that some people have more willpower than others, that they're better at powering through these changes. But most of the research seems to indicate that that's not true. That essentially you can teach people willpower, that it's an acquired skill, and that a lot of that has to do with habit formation around willpower. Let me take one more. Yeah. And again, feel free to go. Thank you all so much for coming. Yeah.
So about your last answer there, it seems like a lot of people change habits, for example, when they find religion. How does that correlate to the answer that you asked me? You seem to say that it's people who know about cues and rewards who are able to change, versus a lot of like real world examples. People say, I found God and I found this religion.
So the question is, why do people who suddenly become religious, why do they change their habits? Why are these? And in psychology, this is known as a quantum change moment. That some people, for some reason, seem to change their entire life at once. So the answer is really interesting because it's for two reasons. The first of which is that we know that habits become more malleable at certain points in our life, and those points are usually during massive upheavals. So very often when someone finds religion or something similar, there's usually a preceding event, right? The death of someone or some type of personal crisis or an existential crisis. People usually have some reason why they go looking for religion. And what psychologists think is that this moment of massive upheaval essentially makes their habits more malleable. And then they find some type of religion or something similar with a reward system embedded in it that all of a sudden causes them to crave new rewards, which filters through their habits into new behaviors. And it's not just like these emotional moments. For instance, when if you buy, has anyone bought a house recently? I'm supposed to close on a house in like 3 days. Okay, so this is really interesting. When you buy a new house, according to studies, you are much more likely to start buying a new brand of coffee. If you get a divorce, and this is really only true of men, if you get a divorce, you're much more likely to start buying new brands of beer. I guarantee you, you are not aware of the fact that you're buying new brands of beer when you're getting a divorce, or buying new brands of coffee when you're buying a house, because you're so overwhelmed by getting a divorce or buying a house. But for some reason, during major life upheavals, your consumption, your habits, your buying habits change. Not just buying habits, but all habits become more malleable. And in fact, this is why Target looks for people who are pregnant, is because the biggest upheaval in someone's life is usually when they have a baby. And Target knows that they can take advantage of all of these suddenly malleable habits to get their coupons into their hands. So I think that's the first answer, is that in some ways, finding religion is a symptom of a deeper underlying shift in someone's life that makes their habits more malleable. But then the second part of it is that oftentimes what they're attracted to, religion, some type of therapy program, yoga, whatever it is that they're coming to that sort of gives them these new habits, almost all of those are reward systems that are changing what the desired reward is, right? I mean, that's essentially what religion is it says, rather than look for earthly rewards, look for spiritual rewards, right? And I think that when that shift happens in what reward you are craving, that it filters through your behaviors, and that's why habits can emerge much more easily. I'd love, if anyone has any other questions, I'd love to answer them, or feel free to email me. I'm just charles@charlesduhigg.com. Also, if you have any suggestions of things that we should be covering in the iEconomy series, I'd love to hear from you. And thank you all again so much. I really appreciate it. Oh, and there's books for sale, and I'd love to sign your books if that's useful.